Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Jiha Chun, and on behalf of UCLA's International Institute, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event. This event is part of a year-long series inspired by the groundbreaking movement for Black lives and the urgent political issues it raises about systemic racism and institutional violence, both in the US and around the world. Our inaugural event last month, which featured Professors Brenda Stevenson and Deborah Thomas, discussed the Black Lives Matter movement in the historical context of slavery, segregation, and abolition movements in the US and their complex afterlives in countries like Jamaica. Today's distinguished speakers, Professors Christine Hong and Anne Garland Mahler, turn our attention to the Americas and Asia and the Pacific, and discuss how movements for racial and decolonial liberation were shaped by the dynamics of Cold War militarism, US empire building, and global racial capitalism. Before we get to the main event, I wanted to offer some brief words of acknowledgement and gratitude. First and foremost, UCLA and the International Institute acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, Los Angeles Basin, and the South Channel Islands, and are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarak Hatom indigenous peoples in this place. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to Honukvetam, ancestors, Ahihiram, elders, and Iyuhinkam, our relatives' relations, past, present, and emerging. At the International Institute, we thank the leadership of Vice Provost for International Studies and Global Engagement, Cindy Fan, and Senior Associate Vice Provost and Director of the International Institute, Chris Erickson, who have enthusiastically supported this initiative from the onset. I also want to thank my extraordinary colleagues and fellow conspirators, Jorge Martirano, Lori Hart, Robin Derby, Shana Potts, Ippolitos Calafanos, Alden Young, and Erica Anjum for their vision and hard work in putting together this exciting series, which is really an unprecedented collaboration across the International Institute's many centers and programs. Our deepest thanks also to the dedicated staff at the International Institute, Catherine Paul, Peggy McGurney, Kaya Mentasoglu, Alex Ju, Oliver Chen, Chloe Hyuga, and Stephen Acosta, whose essential support and expertise make events like today possible. Today's event is co-presented by the Center for Korean Studies, directed by Nam-hee Lee, and the Program in Caribbean Studies, directed by Jorge Martirano. Our co-sponsors include the Asian American Studies Center, the Bunch Center for African American Studies, and the Departments of Asian American Studies and Spanish and Portuguese. Our format will include 20-minute presentations from each of our distinguished speakers, followed by a moderated Q&A. And we ask that attendees submit their questions on the webinar's Q&A, and then we'll address them after the talks. A recording of the event will also be posted on the International Institute's website. For time's sake, we have posted the full bios of our distinguished speakers and moderators in the chat. I am thrilled to briefly introduce our speaker, Professor Christine Hong, Associate Professor in the Literature Department and Director of the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Program at UC Santa Cruz. In addition to her extraordinary scholarship in transnational Asian American studies, African American literature and Black freedom studies, and US War and Empire, she is actively involved in the national campaign to end the Korean War and the Korea Policy Institute. Her talk today, Gulag in quotes, North Korea, question mark, Black anti-fascist critique of US police action in Korea, draws from her acclaimed new book, A Violent Peace, Race, US Militarism, and the Cultures of Democratization in Cold War Asia and the Pacific. And that's just hot off the press at Stanford University Press. Okay, so now I want to turn it to Jorge to introduce Anne Garland Mahler and Katsuya Hirano.
Jorge, you're muted.
Thank you.
Jorge.
Yeah, I am Jorge Marturano, the chair of the program on Caribbean Studies of the Latin American Institute. No, and thank you everybody again for being here on Zoom. And for me, it is an honor to introduce Professor Anne Garland Mahler to all of you. Dr. Mahler obtained her PhD from Emory University and is associate professor at the University of Virginia and author of From the Continental to the Global South, Race, Radicalism, and Transnational Solidarity, published by Duke in 2018. It's a wonderful book I recommend to everybody. Professor Mahler's research examines the histories and artistic production of global radicalism with a focus on transnational solidarity movements in the Americas. She is the creator and director of the digital publication Global South Studies, co-coordinator of the internationalism project within the Academy of Global Humanities and Critical Theory, and co-editor of the book The Comintern and the Global South, forthcoming with Routledge. Her monograph in progress, South-South Solidarities, Racial Capitalism and Political Community from the Americas to the Globe, is supported by the 2021 American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship. Her presentation is entitled Racial Capitalism and Solidarity Movement from the Americas to the Globe. Thank you, Anne Garland, for being here. And next, I want to introduce our dear Katsuya Hirano, who is associate professor at the Department of History at UCLA. He is the author of The Politics of Dialogic Imagination, Power and Popular Culture in Early Modern Japan, published by Chicago University Press. In his current book project examines the intersection of capitalism and racism in the making of modern Japanese imperial nation and its first colony. Professor Hirano is also co-editing a translation volume with Professor Gavin Walker entitled The Archive of Revolution, Marxist Historiography in Modern Japan. Thank you, Katz, for being here. Christine?
Let me share my screen. Yeah, there we go. So I want to begin by thanking all of the organizers, Katz as well, for facilitating today's discussion, as well as all of the center staff. So I'll go ahead and begin. In the wake of 9/11, shadowed by the prospect of renewed US interventionist war with North Korea, the image of North Korea, not simply as a society with prisons, but as an unparalleled police state, in effect, a giant gulag, moved onto the global stage as a matter of militarized human rights concern. In the contemporary era, no image has arguably gone further in cementing North Korea's illegitimacy. Excuse me. As the most obscure target of the war on terror yoked to Iran and Iraq in George W. Bush's axis of evil, North Korea emerged as the phantasmatic grounds for a neoconservative human rights cottage industry aimed at its collapse. The heady decade that followed 9/11 would bear witness to the emergence of human rights technologies ostensibly aimed at freeing North Koreans from tyranny, including imagery intelligence, satellite images like this, that were interoperable with technologies of interventionist war. And so you can think here about how the principal ways of knowing North Korea in the contemporary period are and human imagery intelligence and human intelligence. And these ways of knowing North Korea were also constituted the flawed epistemological basis that the US, on which the Bush administration made a case for war in Iraq. And so you could also see that this so-called hidden gulag is paradoxically hyper-visible. Insofar as human rights in the West can be understood as anti-communism by another name, as legal scholar Samuel Moyn has argued, it is unsurprising that the gang of virtue that mobilized under the North Korean human rights banner, US soft power institutions, cold warriors, qua human rights advocates, hawks across the aisle, anti-communist evangelicals in South Korea and the Korean diaspora, and North Korean defectors consistently argued against food aid and other humanitarian measures while advocating for fortified sanctions, military intervention, and advanced plans for refugee camps to house fleeing North Koreans after an externally triggered regime collapse. And so here we might recall the words of Adrian Hong, the Korean American son of Korean missionaries Korean immigrant missionaries who founded the organization in the immediate post 9/11 period, Liberty in North Korea. It was actually originally called Liberation in North Korea, or LINK. And what he stated was, North Korea is not a failed state. It is on another level entirely. It's a staggering system entirely built and mastered for the express purpose of propagating human suffering and ensuring the continued exploitation of the people so that very few can benefit. This is what he said. So the Manichaean geopolitical imaginary of North Korean human rights could be summed up as tyranny there, freedom here, but we can go even further. WMDs, nuclear proliferation, over-the-top defense spending, there. Domestic surveillance, political imprisonment, militarized borders, religious intolerance, hunger, there. Geared toward regime change, a supersession by whatever means of the vile there, with a kinder, gentler here, human rights advocates calling for North Korea's freedom frequently pitch the vast growth potential of a post-collapse North Korea brightened by a neoliberal agenda. In a 2011 article in Foreign Policy, Hong, this is Adrian Hong, contributed to the speculative fever around North Korean regime change. Quote, with the right inputs, a North Korea free of the Kim regime would bring about opportunities for economic development, investment, and trade, end quote. Although Link has since disavowed Hong, who early in 2019, as part of a murky organization called Free Chosun, carried out a raid against the North Korean embassy in Spain, it is worth dwelling on how his human rights agenda has evolved. As his actions to topple the North Korean leadership grew bolder, his rhetoric shifted. In the most recent issue of The New Yorker, the writer Suki Kim, and for those of you who know her writing, you know that she has long been a merchant of North Korean pathology, describes Hong as offering a single word explanation of his organization's goal, abolition. And so you can see here that he says that the goal of his organization is abolition. If recent times have seen the mainstreaming of abolition, Hong's opportunistic seizure of the term might alight us to its rhetorical perversion specific to the post 9/11 neoconservative North Korean human rights agenda. Deployed as part of an ahistorical jargon of power, it signally fails to account for the carceral logic behind unabating US interventionist war, rendering illegible the structural violence perpetrated in multi-directional ways by imperial nations like the United States. And here I would just note that this year, 2020, is the 70th year of the unresolved Korean War. This is a war that has yet to be ended. It is, in the words of Bruce Cummings, our longest, or the United States' longest forever war. North Korea's post-Cold War image as the world's most heinous police state requires, as I contend in this talk, critical contextualization against the early Cold War US police action that placed North Korea in the US war machine's crosshairs, I reached back to the mid-20th century when the United States emerged as a global police power in order to excavate a Black radical critique of and anti-imperialist organizing around US intervention in Korea. Black anti-fascism, both during World War II and throughout the Cold War, served as a revelatory lens with regard to the centrality of warfare to the political economy of the United States. It disclosed not just the identity, but also the fascism of US war and police power. By delving into the archives of the Civil Rights Congress, a Black anti-fascist organization, I want to dwell on the linkages between the policeman's bullet in the United States and US police action in Korea. So presented by Paul Robeson to the United Nations in 1951, the Civil Rights Congress, or CRC, petition We Charge Genocide principally sought to make Jim Crow and the violence of lynching legible as a crime within the supranational framework of human rights, thus indicting US criminality on the world stage. And you can see here, I excerpted part of Robeson's speech, and he gave this speech on June 28th, 1950 at Madison Square Garden. And it was a speech, basically critiquing US intervention in the Korean War. As a result of this kind of anti-war peace agitation, the State Department seized his passport. And this was just part of a concerted national security campaign to neutralize Black radicals like Paul Robeson. Yet in a moment in which the United States was waging a ruthless war of intervention in Korea, a war in which the United States ruled the skies, perpetrating what Bruce Cummings has called a bombing Holocaust below, this petition insisted on the structural correlation between US domestic and foreign policy, construing racism within the United States to be the domestic expression of a global pattern of US imperialism. As William Patterson and other petition authors reasoned, racist violence and economic exploitation in the United States would beget more of the same as it projected its war power abroad. So I want to read from We Charge Genocide, this 1951 petition. We, Negro petitioners, whose communities have been laid waste, whose homes have been burned and looted, whose children have been killed, whose women have been raped, have noted with peculiar horror that the genocidal doctrines and actions of the American white supremacists have already been exported to the colored people of Asia. We solemnly warn that a nation which practices genocide against its own nationals may not be long deterred if it has the power from genocide elsewhere. Making a case for two-fronted genocide, the petition continued. Jellied gasoline in Korea and the lyncher's faggot at home are connected in more ways than that both result in death by fire. The lyncher cannot murder unpunished and unrebuked without so encouraging the bomber that the peace of the world and the lives of millions are endangered. So in a moment in which the United States was waging what Truman euphemistically dubbed a police action, the morphology of lynching had shifted, as the CRC petition made plain, from the lyncher's noose to the policeman's bullet. If widely dismissed as procedural doublespeak, a way to paper over Truman's deployment of the US military without a congressional declaration of war, the shibboleth police action, if critically retrieved, clarifies the carceral logic of over 70 years of US interventionist war against North Korea. And I just want to mention that several years ago, I was speaking with Felipe Luciano, who was one of the co-founders of the Young Lords in New York City. And, I was speaking to him about this and he immediately got it. And he essentially said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that it was as if the United States had surrounded North Korea with a scaled up version of a SWAT team and shouted, "Come on out with your hands up." And I also want to mention the South Korean documentary filmmaker Kim Dong-won, whose film, Songhwan, its repatriation, details the political incarceration of long-term unconverted prisoners in South Korea. The decades-long effort to brutalize these prisoners into renouncing North Korea, he argues, is akin to the isolation imposed on North Korea as a result of over several decades of aggressive US policy. As Kim puts it, quote, "By refusing to sign a non-aggression pact, the United States must also share the blame. The US's economic sanctions and threats of war against the North remind me of the conversion scheme against the prisoners. Just as the scheme failed to break the prisoners, American threats will fail to break the North." So I want to think here about the lines of solidarity that are implied in the structural critique of the Civil Rights Congress petition, and to realize that this critique, this sort of two-fronted sort of genocidal charge against the United States emerged in part out of an anti-fascist milieu that bears revisiting. And here I'm speaking about Los Angeles in the 1940s and early 1950s. At the height of the McCarthy era, Los Angeles was home to a local chapter of the Civil Rights Congress, as well as a bilingual Korean English newspaper called 독립신문, or Korean Independence, whose editorial policy was plain, quote, "Stop the war in Korea, oust Seungmin Rhee, and tell all powers outside Korea, hands off." And it was also home to the LA Committee for the Protection of the Foreign Born. Many of these people who protested US actions in Korea were lined up for deportation. And all of these organizations protested not only US interventionist war in Korea, but also political policing in the United States. And I just want to demonstrate, this is North Korean propaganda that was distributed on the battlefields of the Korean War, and you can see that it's addressed to Negro soldiers. Basically, this pamphlet too, it actually takes wholesale, and it's a multi-page pamphlet, language from the Civil Rights Congress petition. The membership and the leadership of the Civil Rights Congress, this is to say, were reading 독립신문. They, moreover, were organizing against the HUAC persecution and deportation of Korean immigrants who edited that anti-imperialist publication. And they sought to expose the genocidal relationship between anti-Black lynching domestically and US interventionist war in Korea. And so here you could see that in these, the publication, 독립신문, as well as this leaflet, that there's a structural homology that is raised between the racialized war target and the racial profile. And so here you could see how Black radical critique in this moment, as well as North Korean anti-imperialist critique, converge. The linkage between US imperialist aggression abroad and its counterinsurgent violence against domestic populations was clear, domestic populations that were deemed to be enemies, was clear to within both traditions. It was basically, the linkage was fascism. And so I just want to, in the interest of time, just show you that there is a kind of afterlife to this too. The Black Panther Party with the anti-imperialist delegation, the first stop was North Korea. And you can see Eldridge Cleaver here in the publication, on the cover of the publication, The Black Panther. And you could also see that he, and I took, this is an excerpt at the bottom from Eldridge Cleaver's introduction to a publication that was called Juche. Yeah, so I want to just say, I'm just dwelling on this critique of US fascism. As a self-exculpatory discourse wielded by the capitalist bloc, the Cold War catchphrase totalitarianism served ideologically to estrange fascism from its genesis and location in industrial capitalism and to yoke it instead with communism, thus evacuating fascism's meaning and warping the clarity of the anti-fascist critique of US militarism, precisely as US war power assumed unprecedented infrastructural form around the globe following World War II. And we can think here of the US national security state, the military industrial complex, the empire of bases, and the permanent war economy. And so I want to close by saying that I really appreciate this opportunity to begin having much needed contemporary dialogue around the interlocking nature of US police and war power, and by extension, the criticality of anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism to the abolitionist struggle. But I also want to say that far more than a legacy of the Cold War, US militarism persists unabated today, yet absent a ready idiom of international solidarity that accounts for the multidirectionality of its violence. Absent, this is to say, the trenchant critique that anti-fascism enabled. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to pull up my presentation. Let's see. Okay, first I just want to thank UCLA's International Institute, the organizers and sponsors, and especially Jorge and Jennifer and Namhi for inviting me, and Takatsu for moderating. I'm honored to be able to speak alongside Christine Hong, and I'm grateful that you all have provided this space to think about the long arc and international nature of racial justice work. In 2018, as Jorge mentioned, I published my first book, From the Tricontinental to the Global South. I'm working on a new project that moves backwards historically to the interwar years. But this new project has some inherent connections to the Tricontinental book. So I'm going to try to bridge these two together today, talking mostly about the new project and then a bit about the Tricontinental at the end. So let's see if I can get this to work. Here we go. So in June 2018, 40 children stood on the steps of the New York offices of ICE, holding signs that read, "I am a child." The signs, created by artist Paula Mendoza to protest the detention of migrant children and the separation of families at the border, clearly recalled the recognizable protest placards of the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers' strike, in which Martin Luther King Jr. was actively involved in the days leading up to his assassination. This is one of many political actions in recent years that draw links between the logics of anti-Black racism and anti-immigrant nativism, and that speaks to an increasing consciousness around the central role of immigrant rights in a larger struggle for racial justice. Within the United States, organizations like the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and the Undocu-Black Network have been leading voices in framing an intersectional anti-racist politics. And with intersectional, I'm obviously referring to Kimberly Williams Crenshaw's work. These movements have emerged not only within the broader movement for Black lives, but also within a renewed moment of transnational solidarity politics, facilitated by innovations in information and communication technologies that we've witnessed since at least the 2008 Occupy protests, but that has deeper roots in Latin America's Marea Rosada of the late 1990s. Today, I want to frame this contemporary moment of intersectional and transnational solidarity politics by thinking about histories that precede it, and specifically by revisiting two key solidarity movements of the 20th century that were centered in the American continent. Both these movements, the Anti-Imperialist League of the Americas of the 1920s and 30s, and the Tricontinental that began in the 1960s, conceived of the operation of power through a global frame and examined the overlapping mechanics of finance capitalism with earlier histories of European colonization. Ultimately, both movements, although with distinct discourses and aesthetics, aim to bridge a global anti-capitalist movement with racial justice organizing. Social movements today face particular challenges, like the question of how to navigate the complex relationship between the globalized and networked nature of contemporary power, so like the role of transnational corporations and transnational elites, for example, and the locally socio-spatial context of inequality and racialization. Beginning with Cedric Robinson's initial 1983 formulation of racial capitalism and Black Marxism, theories of racial capitalism have attempted to trace how racialization evolves with the development of and changes within the capitalist system. Robinson's work has served as a platform for a wave of scholarship that both expands upon and critiques his theories, drawing attention, for example, to his silences on gender and sexuality, and to his essentialist notions of African culture that he holds up in counterpoint to Marxist traditions. In one very recent example of this scholarship, Charisse Burden-Stelly, in a July 2020 Monthly Review article, defines what she calls modern US racial capitalism, a post-World War I, quote, racially hierarchical political economy constituting war and militarism, imperialist accumulation, expropriation by domination, and labor super exploitation, end quote. On the other hand, there are scholars like Jody Melamed and Charles Hale, who have theorized a differently articulated racial formation in the post-1970s era that they refer to as neoliberal multiculturalism, where contemporary racialization is not necessarily based on biological determinism or on the military occupations that have undergirded the US imperialist model that Charisse Burden-Stelly is talking about, but on one's access to the multicultural rights of the free market. Racialized privilege is ascribed to those who adhere to the protocols of a racialized system of control, or what Aiwa Ong describes as health regimes, acquisition of skills, and other techniques of self-engineering and capital accumulation. Those who do not adhere to these protocols are ascribed with racialized stigma like backwardness and irrationality. I find it useful to conceive of overlapping and evolving racial regimes. In other words, we are in a process of understanding these overlapping racial logics, the legacies of colonial modes of domination, which some describe simply as coloniality, versus the neoliberal multiculturalism of late racial capitalism, just as we're looking for ways to balance our understanding of the globalized nature of contemporary power with the rescaled spatial and racial formations that it produces. And even as the work on racial capitalism is expanding, so much of this work has focused on the US context and on a US intellectual genealogy, which is something that this series is, and the people involved with it are obviously pushing against. So I want to look back to earlier examples of transnational political thinking on racial capitalism, focusing especially on those that emerged out of Spanish-speaking Latin America. So let's start with the Anti-Imperialist League of the Americas, La Liga Antiimperialista de las Américas, or LADLA, which was founded in 1925 in Mexico City. There's a really detailed organizational study of LADLA out there by a scholar named Daniel Kurzfeld that you can check out, and I definitely recommend. LADLA, which was largely funded by the Comintern, brought together urban trade unions, agrarian organizations, and cultural and artistic groups to combat US and European commercial and military expansion, and eventually the rise of Depression-era nationalism. It was established with the goal of forming a hemispheric alliance among anti-imperialist of Latin American countries with those in the United States, and of forging a multiracial political community that early on focused on advancing indigenous struggles, but then expanded to focus on Black and immigrant struggles. Its vision was based in a theorization of a transnational extractive zone, to use Macarena Gomez Barris's term, managed by a form of transnational racial policing. For this reason, it centered agrarian populations as core to the anti-imperialist movement, since these populations live in the extractive zone and disproportionately experience its most negative consequences. LADLA eventually grew to include 12 chapters throughout the Americas. Among its core leadership were well-known artists and intellectuals of the moment, like Mexican indigenous Nahua artist Javier Guerrero, and other Mexican artists like Diego Rivera and David Siqueiros, US activist Bertram Manolo Wolf, exiled Cuban political leader Julio Antonio Mella, and Italian-American photographer Tina Modotti, among others. On the screen is the cover of the third issue of its publication, El Libertador, The Liberator. All the illustrations were done by Javier Guerrero, like this one, with the exception of a few that were done by Diego Rivera. The first issue, March 1925, of El Libertador, explains the creation of LADLA as the necessary response to the expanding economic and military domination of the United States over Cuba, Panama, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Mexico. In response to this expansion, Latin American radicals must ally with US radicals to form, quote, a single anti-imperialist continental movement, which can then, quote, eventually perhaps save Europe, Asia, and Africa as well, end quote. So there's a hemispheric vision at the outset, but this hemispheric project is intended to build outward towards a global one. Within 2 years, at the 1927 Congress Against Colonial Oppression and Imperialism and for National Independence in Brussels, LADLA members joined with delegates around the world to form the Global League Against Imperialism. There, Latin American radicals would interact with some of the world's foremost anti-colonial intellectuals and activists of the 20th century. Although most of the work on this legendary Congress, a Congress that was so foundational to post-colonial studies, most of the work has focused on Afro-Asian connections. This moment was extremely important for radicals in the Americas. It is through the Brussels Congress that LADLA members would reject Latin America's most popular regionalist ideologies like mestizaje and Hispanoamericanismo for a hemispheric globalism, in which they expanded on hemispheric connections with worker and minority struggles in the United States to embrace an interdependency with anti-imperialist movements around the world. If the Brussels Congress offered LADLA organizers the chance to see more clearly the connections between their struggles and those of other colonial contexts, it also helped them to draw deeper connections with non-Spanish speaking communities that were closer geographically, like US Black activists and organizations from the Francophone and Anglophone Caribbeans. Significantly, the encounter with Black activists from other contexts in Brussels would inspire a process of expanding LADLA's initial focus on indigenous struggles to think more critically about Black labor, including Black migrant labor in the Americas. LADLA's initial focus on indigenous communities is significant in that it anticipates contemporary critiques of theories of racial capitalism by some indigenous studies scholars like Glenn Cotard, for example, for the way those theories center racial slavery and the role of labor and proletarianization rather than the dispossession at the heart of settler colonialism. But the Brussels Congress is a moment of expansion in LADLA's vision, and it would also influence LADLA to theorize white supremacist and fascist ideologies as an integral part of imperialist domination. LADLA's move away from Latin American regionalisms allowed it to eventually move beyond the familiar trappings of Latin American racial exceptionalism, which, as we all know, celebrates Latin American countries as supposed racial democracies. In the Latin American resolution from the Brussels Congress, published in El Libertador, the very first mention of Black labor in this publication appears in the phrase, quote, imperialist penetration in these countries has exacerbated the inequality faced by indigenous and Black peoples because of the concentration of land, since Black and indigenous people constitute the vast majority of the agrarian population, end quote. Through this resolution, LADLA redefined its anti-imperialist program to address anti-Black discrimination and dispossession as a central part of the extractive economy, identifying indigenous and Black communities as key to the worldwide anti-imperialist struggle. However, alongside the Latin American resolution, El Libertador also reprinted the common resolution on the Negro question, created at the Brussels Congress. This resolution contained a curious statement regarding Spanish-speaking Latin America. It read, in Latin America, Negroes suffer no special oppression. The cordial relations resulting from the social and political equality in the races in these countries prove that there is no inherent antagonism between them, end quote. Importantly, when this resolution was reprinted in Spanish, the LADLA editors made revisions to the statement, specifically in the section that discussed Latin America, adding text to the original that offered Cuba and Panama as exceptions to the resolution's general claim about Latin America, but importantly attributing anti-Black racism in these places to US influence. Ladla's ambiguous position on anti-Black racism in 1927 is a reflection of its nascent theorizing on this issue at this point, as well as a reflection of the absence of Spanish-speaking Black Latin American delegates in Brussels. These positions, however, would later be fervently critiqued by an Afro-Cuban activist and Ladla member named Sandalio Junco, who will put forth a new resolution on the Negro question in the Americas, one based in his own Afro-Latin American subjectivity, and whose influence will very importantly turn Ladla's focus toward Black immigrant labor. At two back-to-back conferences in 1929, the first Latin American Communist Conference in Buenos Aires and the Confederation of Latin American Labor Unions in Montevideo, Junco, who had been living in exile in Mexico City, where he was working as Ladla's provisional secretary, pushes forward a conversation about the so-called Negro question in Latin America. He presented a little known but foundational text of Black internationalism, where he called for an outreach campaign to Black American workers and insisted on the need to address anti-Black racism among Latin American radicals, despite disavowals of the existence of this problem by other delegates at the conference. Junco disagreed with many of the participants' strict differentiation between Black and Indigenous experiences, and he drew comparisons between the racialization of Black Latin Americans and those of other racialized populations throughout the hemisphere, such as Indigenous, US African Americans, Haitian and West Indian migrant workers, and Chinese immigrants. This issue of his identification with migrant workers is, I think, especially important. In this speech, Junco makes a repeated rhetorical move where he starts out by talking about the conditions of Black workers in the US South, and then relates that experience to the inequities faced primarily by Black workers throughout the continent, explaining that these conditions are especially dire for Black migrant workers from Haiti and the West Indies, who are employed by US-owned companies in the region. Since the recruitment of migrant workers in the Hispanophone Caribbean was tied to the US sugar industry, when that industry collapsed in the economic crisis that became the Great Depression, an anti-imperialist discourse arose in Cuba that was often expressed through a nativist anti-immigrant rhetoric that was articulated through anti-Blackness and especially through anti-Haitianism. Junco condemned the spread of nativism among the working classes and especially among Black national citizens towards their Black migrant coworkers. Jim Crow racism, he claimed, extends throughout Yankee land and its territories, those are his words, where US companies and the complicit national bourgeoisies use nativism to divide and conquer workers, drumming up racial hatred even among Black national citizens like Black Cubans toward migrant workers. Importantly, Junco did not fall into the trap of externalizing blame only to the United States. Anti-Black racism, like anti-Indigenous racism, he claimed, are foundational elements of Latin America's capitalist societies. Ultimately, Junco presented a transnational system of anti-Black violence and pointed to the intersections between the oppression of various communities. This rhetorical move that he makes repeatedly, where he starts with racial inequity in the US South and then uses it as a frame for pushing his mostly Latin American interlocutors beyond a Depression-era nationalism towards an identification, not just with their own Black national colleagues, but with Black immigrant workers, is a strategy that appears in many Comintern and related publications in the Americas in subsequent years, as well as in a whole set of related literary production, a set of proletarian novels that emerge in Latin America in this moment. In this moment, the Caribbean, as Michelle Stevens has pointed out, is uniquely positioned at the decline of European empires and the rise of the United States, and at the transition from older territorial forms of colonial control to an economic control based on the dominance of multinational monopolies and finance capital. Thinking through the relationships between the US South and Latin America becomes a way of theorizing the overlap between various imperial forms and the overlapping mechanisms of racial segregation and oppression. In this thinking the South and the North and then relating it to other Souths, an early intersectional anti-racist politics emerges, as well as a theory on a transnational form of anti-labor racial policing that impacts Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. Junco's intervention, which is relatively marginal to Ladla's discourse, will become central to another anti-imperialist movement a few decades later, that of the Tricontinental. The Tricontinental, created in January 1966, when delegates from 82 nations came together in Havana to form the Organization of Solidarity with the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the OSPAL. It will use the Jim Crow South as a microcosm of its global political struggle. So the immediate origins of this tricontinental movement are in Cold War Afro-Asianisms that, but like the AAPSO, for example. But as this Afro-Asian movement joined with movements in the Americas to become the tricontinental, it really picked up on this earlier hemispheric American discourse from Mahler. The Tricontinental produced a massive amount of cultural production in English, Spanish, French, and sometimes Arabic, which included magazines, journals, books, pamphlets, radio programs, newsreels. Much of this material, especially in its early years, focused on the Jim Crow South and on the African American liberation movement. So here's just a few of these materials, but like I said, there's a lot. So in my book on the Tricontinental, I trace how in these materials, the Jim Crow racial divide of white and colored is used as a metonym, not for a global color line per se, but for a tricontinental power struggle in which all radicalized exploited peoples are implicated. So the Tricontinental frequently describes its political subjectivity as colored peoples, but it uses this to refer to a shared ideological position. And these materials begin to compare the US South to South Africa, to the Southern Cone of Latin America, and eventually just replace that notion of colored and exploited peoples with the term Sur, South, to refer to its global political movement. Through this discourse, the Tricontinental picks up on Ladla's project and also seeks to respond to earlier problems, specifically within the communist movement, by forging a global anti-capitalist struggle that foregrounds racial justice. And that is especially focused on anti-Black racism. So rather than a class-based movement that Black activists can be incorporated into, for example, it is a movement that centers Black activism, but with the intention of opening onto a transracial political community. And I should say that the Tricontinental interacts in very interesting ways with the Cuban states' problematic domestic racial discourse, and I can discuss that in the Q&A. And I also will say, I trace the discourse of tricontinentalism in these materials produced by the OSPAL, but also in a number of radical movements, the Black Arts movements, the Young Lords, the Nuyorican movement, for example. The histories that I have briefly laid out here are still with us in some ways and not in others. The way that Junco, for example, connects transnational forms of anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant nativism, and labor policing precedes the kind of text that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. In the case of the Tricontinental, contemporary social movements, especially the alter-globalization movement, depend on this history in significant ways. A global understanding of power, ideological political identities that are forged through discourses of solidarity, a revival of the Tricontinental's radical aesthetics. But it must also be said that the alter-globalization movement often suffers from a complicity with colorblind neoliberal multiculturalism. And racial justice organizing throughout the American hemisphere has tended to focus its critique on reforming the state, sidelining at times a broader consideration of the intersection between racial violence and global capital flows. With this in mind, I think it is necessary for us to revisit these largely elided histories of transnational movements against racial capitalism, and to think about their successes and failures as they sought to bring together resistant communities across national, linguistic, and racial difference. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine and Anne Garland. While we wait for questions from the audience, by the way, please send us questions so that I can read them out to the presenters and then we can start our discussions. But while we wait for questions, maybe let me ask you just questions. I just prepared one question for each of you so that I don't take up so much time. So for Christine, I'd like to know your perspective on the rise of right-wing populism or right-wing racist movement, not only in the US, but also in Asia. Your presentation shows brilliantly the various forms of state violence grounded in transnational regime of racism built by the US empire in the Asia-Pacific region. I learned a lot specifically about the ways in which America's liberatory and democratic rhetoric, the so-called Pax Americana, has worked as a way to implement necropolitics of war machine to justify police brutality and pit us against each other as enemies. What I want to hear from you is how we situate the problem of right-wing grassroots movement in relation to this transnational regime of racism. It seems to me that the Cold War environment that you analyzed so effectively is deeply related to the recent rise of right-wing racist movement that invokes the Cold War discourse of anti-socialism, communism, and leftist. It's happening not only in the US, but also in Japan, India, and elsewhere. In other words, how should we understand the link between the various forms of state violence and invigoration of racist populism? So that's a question for you. And then I have a question for Ankara.
Okay.
So my question for you is about solidarity movement in our time. I'm inspired by your discussion of the tricontinental as akin to what we refer to as global south, that places an emphasis on common histories of exploitation and oppression while avoiding racial essentialism. It seems to me that one of the tricontinental's contribution is its ability to articulate the importance of finding commonness in difference and difference in commonness by paying attention to both race and class, as well as their intersectionality. When we think about our current intellectual climate in public and academic discourses, it seems to me that we still see much disjuncture or disconnect between race and class. In public discourse, we almost exclusively talk about race, whereas in academia, critical race studies and Marxian analysis of class don't really talk to each other. They don't really talk to each other in any way. Marxist scholars always insist on class analysis, whereas critical race theorists tend to emphasize race. So I agree that that's why the concept of racial capitalism is so important for the formation of solidarity in our time. I want to hear from you what lessons and inspirations we can learn from the tricontinental's effort to put race and class analysis in dialogue. So that's a question for you. Okay, Christine, would you like to start?
Yeah, so Katz, thank you so much for that very thoughtful and very complex question. And I can see that you're both responding to the presentation that I just gave, as well as parts of my book project, which you read. And I should say that today's presentation, although it draws in part conceptually from that first book project, actually tilts toward my second book project. So I wanted to disentangle parts of your question. And in my book project, it's called A Violent Peace. I look at the racism of US militarism and the question about how then there is a kind of reactionary rightist sort of response to militarism is a complex one. And there isn't an overarching homogeneous answer for all the geographic sites that you listed. But what I'll say is that in the US instance, and here we can think about Tak Fujitani's work too, when he's talking about World War II and, comparatively examining Japanese Americans who are enfolded into the US war machine, and then thinking about how Korean colonial subjects are also enfolded into the Japanese imperial war machine. You can see that there is a kind of logic there of inclusion, right? A kind of differential inclusion, to borrow a phrase from ethnic studies scholars, that invites participation or complicity with US war violence as the condition for some sense of expanded national belonging. And of course, anti-fascist critics would call this fascism, not military multiculturalism, but actually fascism, because it's a non-class differentiated national unity that is predicated upon the existence of a shared enemy. So, you know, with regard to militarism and US militarism in particular, and countries in Asia and the Pacific, or to use a kind of contemporary US military term, the Indo-Pacific, you know, I think that it is very interesting that, you know, of course, like, you know, anti-communism becomes the basis for rightist rehabilitation throughout the region. You could see this in the reverse course in Japan. You could see it in many areas throughout Asia and the Pacific. You could see it in the Philippines, in South Korea, you know, many places. But the question of whether or not there is a kind of grassroots politics around militarism is complicated, you know, site by site. And so you could say that, you know, in Japan, the LDP has a kind of, there is a kind of embrace of the kind, a reactionary discourse around the remilitarization of Japan. And then, you know, figures like Oe Kenzaburo and others will actually embrace, you know, the peace clause that's part of the US sort of backed and authored, you know, post-war constitution. But still, you know, that sort of discourse of remilitarization, you know, I'm not actually equipped to say how much populist purchase there is for that. But with regard to the Philippines too, Duterte, you know, such an equivocal political figure, but appeared to sort of embrace, at least rhetorically, to espouse a kind of US military get out type of, you know, language, only to recently, you know, renegotiate the visiting forces agreement, you know. So, you know, part of his populist appeal no doubt had to do with at least some kind of gesture toward Philippine sovereignty, you know what I mean? And but by contrast, in South Korea, you know, I mean, it's not to exceptionalize liberals who are in power. You know, I mean, it's a complicated situation because the sort of discourse around militarism and anti-militarism and anti-bases is the sort of purview of leftists, you know, and then tends to be compromised at the leadership level, you know, so currently, I should say. So that's part of my answer to that. And then the other thing that I would say with regard to the talk that I did give, you know, when it comes to these, you know, people like Adrienne Hong and, you know, these other Korean Americans who agitated so intensely for North Korean regime collapse. You know, it's hard to say that there was anything grassroots about that. You know, you have to point to a number of things. You know, 1965, the sort of so-called liberalization of US immigration policy, it was also part and parcel with earlier Cold War gatekeeping measures that were aimed at the national security policing of populations that were allowed into the United States, communist, you know, or anti-communist, you know, and so thereby sort of biopolitically generating certain kinds of communities. We can think about Miami Cubans, you know, what have you. And Korean Americans were also biopolitically policed in this respect. But it's also to say that with regard to this sort of anti-North Korea human rights agitation, when you look at the funding mechanism behind it, and I look at this very closely in my other work, you look at the National Endowment for Democracy funding and manufacturing what appears to be dissidents. And so in those cases, you have to follow the money, you know. And I don't know, I mean, this is another question, like to what degree is foreign policy ever a populist discourse in the United States? I don't know, you know.
Yeah, Angaland, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for these questions, or for this question. Yeah, I think, you're absolutely right about, okay, sort of like Marxists and, scholars of critical race theory not necessarily always being in conversation, which is why this kind of focus on racial capitalism, I think, is so important. And I think this has been a major motivation for me in wanting to recover these movements, right? When I was first starting to work on the tricontinental, a lot of the response that I would get in Cuban studies was sort of like, oh, just like more propaganda, more Cuban state propaganda sort of thing. So one of the things that was really important to me in the book was to trace the ways that the Cuban state is involved in this movement and the ways that this movement kind of gets away from the Cuban state's control. And I think you're right that we have a lot to learn from it in terms of, as you said, an ability to articulate, finding difference in commonness and vice versa. I think another major contribution of this movement is the ways that it tried to bring class-based and race-based organizing together through centering Black struggles and then expanding outward from there, right? So, the kind of narrative that we have historically about communism is that it, was sort of like class-based movements that then they would try to bring Black organizations into, right? And what you end up having is just a kind of colorblind class-based discourse, that of course that has predominated in Cuba too. So, and I think there's a concept so Opal Tometi, one of the founders of BLM, who ran the Black Alliance for Just Immigration for a while, she has this concept called transformational solidarity. And it's a concept that's, I think, is very similar to tricontinentalism, which is, she basically says like, I can't remember what the exact wording is, but until Black people are free, nobody is free is basically the concept, right? But it's the idea of starting first with Black struggles and then expanding from there. And I think one of the reasons that I'm interested in Ladla from that earlier interwar moment is because I think it challenges the way that we narrate the history of the Comintern, because Ladla, was a Comintern funded organization, but it was supposed to be one of its like mass organizations. So it included, it wasn't just a workers movement, right? It included intellectuals and artists, and it was trying to bridge a lot of different people together, and it had a really flexible ideology. And I think that's something that gets really picked up on in tricontinentalism. I also want to comment quickly, your question to Christine was on like right-wing populism, which I think is just on all of our minds all the time. And I live in Charlottesville, and it's been a huge part of my life now for a couple of years. And I think especially after the 2017 Unite the Right rally and terrorist attack in Charlottesville, it got me thinking a lot, and I've written on this a lot about with a colleague named Joshua Lund, but it got me thinking a lot about the aesthetics of paramilitarism. And one of the big problems, I think, with the tricontinental movement is the aesthetics. Like there's a huge slippage between the kind of aesthetics of paramilitarism that we see in the streets in Charlottesville and what we see in so many of the Tricontinental's posters, the covers of the magazine, this emphasis, there's a huge emphasis on masculinity, on kind of phallic symbology, on the individual, there's all these, like the Obama Hope poster, for example, was based on a number of these Oswald posters where there's this kind of, Lumumba or Amilcar Cabral, like staring into the distance, right? There's this kind of hero worship. And that's another thing that really interests me about Ladla is the aesthetics that I'm seeing of a lot of the artists is a focus on multiplicity, on heterogeneity, on relation. Tina Modotti's her feminist and queer photography. And I think that's something that we're seeing social movements, especially Black feminist movements right now, really recover that kind of aesthetics. And I think that's a really important move that we're seeing social movements make right now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we received some questions for both of you. Let me start with Angaland. Here's a question. What do you consider are the main shortcomings of the tricontinental, and which are the main teaching current movement, such as Black Lives Matter, could learn from those shortcomings? Would you like to respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wow, I mean, there are quite a few shortcomings. I mentioned the aesthetic piece. I think it's really important for movements to think about how they're presenting themselves and to think about the aesthetics as part of the political discourse. To not necessarily, anyway, so I think that's one thing. But one of the biggest shortcomings of the tricontinental movement is that it's very focused on, it's celebrating Black radicalism, it's celebrating Black internationalism, but it's very focused on issues facing Black people in places other than Cuba. And there's not a very nuanced understanding of race, anti-Black racism in socialist and communist countries. So I think the biggest thing that we have to learn from tricontinentalism is it's just extremely internationalist framework. And I think one of the things that I'm really interested in are movements that kind of started, like if we think about the Americas, movements that start south and look northward. And I think that's been a common critique of the movement for Black lives, even as it's becoming more internationalist. But I think, yeah, moving more internationalist, but also learning from the tricontinental's mistakes in trying to be nuanced in the ways that we think about racialization in different contexts.
Great. Okay, so I have a question for both of you. So let me read it out. Both speakers provide critical insight about the contributions of radical Black intellectuals and movements during the earlier periods of military intervention and the US empire. To what extent do we see similar critiques and alliances coming out of Black Lives Matter and movements against anti-Black racism today? So this is a question for both of you. Christine, do you want to start first?
When I was discussing how Adrienne Hong was opportunistically seizing the term abolition, it's not as though, I'm not equating abolition entirely with Black Lives Matter. There's a spectrum of politics out there, but it wasn't as though I was suggesting that there was a kind of commensurate move, within abolitionist circles within the United States to viewing, North Korea in the way that North Korean human rights activists do, but to say that there was a kind of opportunism on one side. And, what I would say about whether there's a similar critique today, and maybe this goes to what Anne was speaking about too, I feel as though the ways in which solidarity was envisioned before, let's think about the late 1960s and the kind of work that a term like Third World, did, and how, that although that sort of raised to view points of continuity between populations that were racialized domestically within the United States and those that were, being targeted by US foreign policy in various ways, it also arguably flattened some differences. And I'm not saying, and another thing that I'll say, and I was saying this to students in Namhee's class the other day, it's that, it's the United States in terms of its counterintelligence campaigns against radicals. And so you can think about, and this is someone who's at Robert Hill, your colleague at UCLA, working on racial conditions in the United States. And that FBI report, which was produced during World War II, basically demonstrated that the United States during a period of total war was targeting domestic populations, because the domestic arena wasn't just a site of war production, it was a site of potential sort of enemy saboteurs, usually racialized subjects, but communists, Black civil rights, organizers, as well as principally Japanese or Asian groups, were all sort of placed under surveillance. And it was a very comprehensive report. And what I'd say is that one thing that you can see is that there was a concerted effort at different moments of radicalism, Black radicalism, to ensure the neutralization of these politics. And what I look at in my book is how that logic of racial counterintelligence, which was a kind of war sort of lens, that it was used both domestically and it was used abroad. The counterintelligence corps, which was in Japan, it was in the Philippines, it was in Korea, it was all over the Pacific. And so this is just to say that when you look at the kind of logic of racial counterintelligence, it takes a very sort of similar form. It's a sort of listing of people who are, quote unquote, with us, white lists, people who are against us, Black lists, targeted for extermination, neutralization, and then gray lists, right? And so it relies upon racial complicity too in the exercise of US police and war power. And the goal is the decapitation of the leadership. There are like security index files that are created. You could see this in Vietnam. You could see this also in COINTELPRO. And what that effectively has meant is not that there is no continuity, but there is a calculated and engineered disruption of genealogies of radicalism. So, people who were part of the New Left, in the 60s, they said that COINTELPRO basically ensured, and maybe this is too far reaching, but I think it's sobering to think about how it ensured that activists were they were in exile, they were in prison, or they were dead. So are there similar sorts of gestures towards solidarity? I do think that there's the opportunity, and this is what I have to say. So many people talk about the militarization of the police. You can only think about the militarization of the police if you're thinking about US wars, right? So there's just like those kinds of connections which are ripe for the making are sort of, I think, emerging. They're not fully fleshed out.
Yeah, just to add to that, I would say, I think we do see similar critiques. I mentioned Opal Tamari's work, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, that's thinking about especially immigrant rights. We see it in BLM's connections to the Palestinian struggle and also to struggles against police violence in Brazil. But sometimes it's hard to know. The media a lot of times tends to present these things as BLM goes to Brazil, which doesn't recognize the incredibly long history of Black Brazilian activism, that preceded BLM. And I've certainly seen it on the ground in Charlottesville, where you have like BLM and anti-fascist activists working together in, immigrant rights stuff and anti-war struggles. But I agree with Christine that, we see a lot of moves in this direction, but it's not to the same extent as some of these earlier movements. And I think that's a big problem when we think that what we're doing is, or I shouldn't say that. I think there is a danger in trying to reinvent the wheel rather than learning from these earlier models and moving them forward.
Okay, thank you. So we have, I think, 2 more questions for both of you. So let me just list the first one. What are some of the contemporary forms of afterlives of the American Black anti-fascism that articulates the linkage between the global patterns of US imperialism and domestic expression? Shall I read it again? So what are some of the contemporary forms of afterlives of the American Black anti-fascism that articulates the linkage between the global pattern of US imperialism and the domestic expression? So this is for actually both of you. Who wants to start? And do you want to start, Garland?
I can try to take a go at it. This is a complicated question that probably requires some more thinking. I mean, I've already mentioned some, like in terms of things we see in social movements. I think, you know, one of the things that I do a lot in the Tricontinental book is I look at the returns of tricontinentalism. I look at it ideologically, I look at it in terms of political praxis, and I also look at it aesthetically. So one of the ways that you see the returns of tricontinentalism is in political poster art. So I look, for example, at a poster, at a really famous poster of Michael Brown that was circulated, you know, all over Twitter and all over the internet. And I look at it up next to these OSPAL posters and the just striking similarities in the images, in what they want to communicate. They're up next to 2 OSPAL posters that were done of Lumumba and Amilcar Cabral after their assassinations. And they're kind of all looking off into the distance at this sort of unpunished, you know, murderer, basically. And just even like the colors, everything is similar. You also see, I mean, like I mentioned the Barack Obama Hope poster, which I think that poster in the way that it relied, so that poster of course was done by Shepard Fairey. Shepard Fairey has been known to straight up copy some of these tricontinental posters and sell them on his website. I mean, some of them are exactly alike. He just changes the logo. And that poster done by Shepard Fairey, which relies so much on these OSPAL, these tricontinental images, I think captures a lot of tensions around the figure of Obama, you know, the way that he was kind of seen as a product of this sort of third worldist imaginary, at the same time that, you know, obviously he's kind of at the forefront of this kind of like neoliberal multicultural capitalist state. So yeah, I'll have to think about that question more, but those are a few things that just come to mind.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a ready answer for that, but I'll say a few things. I mean, one of the, I ended by stating that anti-fascism and Black anti-fascism in particular enabled a critique of US war and police power. And we're in a moment in which abolition, with its profound critique of US police power, you know, has become sort of a sort of household term, you know, but maybe not with the sort of deep sort of analysis that, you know, sort of key organizers have. But there is a kind of, as I was saying earlier, kind of mainstreaming of abolition. But the question that I would pose is, what is the relationship between abolition to anti-imperialist struggle? And I think that there are, of course, key figures who articulate this, you know, but is it a kind of pervasive, urgent, and essential part of the discussion? I am less convinced that it is. I think that this kind of Black anti-fascist capacity to see a kind of, supposedly invisible war within, and then to see US war action abroad. I mean, there are organizations, in the Bay Area. You can think of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, AROC, that profoundly does this, and, was able to get Operation, I think it's Urban Shield, which was trying to sort of sell war materials to local municipalities like Oakland, succeeded in booting them out. But I guess, this is one of the issues that I explore in my first book project. It's basically that, when people think about some of the things that AG was speaking about, for example, Jody Malamed, when she's talking about Cold War multiculturalism, it's this sort of shift, or what Howard Wynant calls the racial break, away from overt white supremacy. Rarely are the sort of origins of that Cold War multiculturalism understood to be military in nature. And so you have someone like Barack Obama. So insofar as Truman had his executive order desegregating the US military, recommending that in 1948, but it's not realized on the ground in a sustained way until the Korean theater. And so, in 2013, on the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Armistice Agreement, Barack Obama spoke on the National Mall in front of a group of South Korean dignitaries from the neoconservative Park Geun-hye government, as well as Korean War veterans, and basically stated that the Korean War was a victory. And it was a victory because he said, over there, Black soldiers, he said Mexican American soldiers, Asian American soldiers, American Indian soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder. And if they could do it over there, then they could do it over here. So in other words, the Korean War, which was profoundly illiberal, and I've argued that US war power has to be understood as fascist, was retrieved as the sort of origins of civil rights, by Barack Obama in this speech. And that obscures the sort of Black anti-fascist critique, this sort of double-fronted genocidal critique. That kind of liberalism, which is military in origin, is powerfully obscuring. But I guess I would just say this too, the Korean War, which is known because of American veterans as the Forgotten War, was absolutely essential to the United States being on permanent war footing. It was the rationale for the entrenchment of the national security complex. It justified the expansion of US military, like the sort of US empire of bases. It rationalized as well the military industrial complex. And I wonder, in this particular historical moment, how we all should be thinking about the intersections between the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex. And I think that is a discussion that needs to be had in deeper and more complex ways.
Okay, so how many more minutes do we have? 6 more minutes. Okay. I'm getting more questions, actually. Let me see. Okay, this question is for both of you. Oh, I'm sorry. This is for AG. Okay. All right. So can you speak more about differences between LADLA and the tricontinental? Because it seems that even though LADLA precedes the tricontinental, LADLA is more evolved ideologically, both in terms of the aesthetics you mentioned, but also in its ethos of peaceful social protest, considering the militaristic rhetoric employed in the tricontinental. What happened? And what happened with this 1920s and 30s emphasis at embracing the arts and the freedom of difference? So that's the
Okay.
question.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I just before I answer that, I wanted to piggyback on what Christine was talking about and just mention the work of Nicole Siegel. I think some of the people doing work in paramilitarism are doing a good job of drawing linkages between, you know, wars abroad, policing at home, border patrol, the prison industrial complex, mainly through just following weapons, following the weapons. The difference between Ladla and Tricontinental. Well, I didn't mean to imply that Ladla believed in peaceful social protests necessarily. This was also a militant organization. These people definitely believed in militancy. Some of them, like Julio Antonio Mella, tried to organize an overthrow of the Cuban state while he was involved in this organization. So these were both militant organizations, and I think there are a number of differences between them. I mean, for one, Ladla is more an organization that has its beginnings in Mexico City, has its beginnings in the hemispheric Americas, and then within a couple of years connects to this more global movement. So it's coming out of a kind of hemispheric American imaginary, whereas the Tricontinental forms out of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization. It is true that the Tricontinental is a more militant movement. Also, the circumstances of the relationship like between China and the Soviet Union at that point are very different. I mean, they're very different organizations, and I didn't mean to imply that one necessarily, you know, there's a perfectly linear relationship between the two, but just to draw a genealogical, a genealogy of, you know, transnational solidarity movements against racial capitalism. So.
Okay, thank you. So this question is for Christine. Have you found any evidence of the ways in which Black anti-racist critique of US imperialism and police action on the Korean Peninsula was circulated and gained traction in post-war North Korea?
You know, so I just want to mention a couple of works, and one is just to follow on AG's comment about work that's coming out, and there's also Stuart Schrader's Badges Without Borders. So there is scholarship that is coming out, but I wanted to also here I would just say that the person whose work I would mention is Monica Kim. So Monica Kim looks at the interrogation rooms of the Korean War, and she really, it's a fascinating and wonderful study. But she actually looks at how, you know, I don't know if you recall, but in the PowerPoint presentation, that North Korean propaganda leaflet actually shows a Black soldier who is in a Chinese POW camp who is shaking hands with the Chinese. And, you know, a number of Black GIs, you know, because they were given the option of repatriating wherever they want, a number of them chose to go to China. And one thing that Monica looks at is how it wasn't as though when North Korean interrogators entered into the room that they had no idea about Jim Crow. They actually did. And you can see that there was a kind of transnational circuitry, maybe through links to the Communist Party, you know, and others, of information. And so one thing that was interesting is that North Korean leaflet, it was giving information that a lot of Black GIs could not get because they were at times denied access to Black newspapers that, you know, mentioned the lynchings that were happening stateside. But Monica Kim speaks about how the interrogators, and there was a sort of dense sort of nexus of different kinds of racial relations within that space, including a lot of, you know, Kibe and Nisei interrogators on the US end who were participating in the interrogations. But you know, it's just to say that, you know, the North Korean interrogators had a very sort of deep understanding of Jim Crow, you know, yeah. And then, you know, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
No, I'm sorry, Christine, you go.
HE, I want to make sure you have the last few minutes.
Oh, okay, I just wanted to say one thing because I was realizing that my response to that person's question was was not really getting to the heart of the question, which was that they were asking me about like why the aesthetics of kind of militarism versus these more like relational aesthetics. And I did want to say that I think that's right in the sense that I think that the tricontinental, I think in a lot of these movements, even though they were internationalists, I think you definitely see the desire for the violence, to possess the violence of the state. And I think even though within Ladla they were militant, like they believed in militancy to an extent, they were actual like true internationalists, like with the exception of Mella, who tried to overthrow the Cuban state, they weren't, in general, they weren't trying to form a new state, right? And I think that has really important implications in the aesthetics. So, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much to both. It's actually time's up. So,
Yeah.
Jorge, would you like to take up?
Yeah. Thank you, Katz. Well, just to make a brief closing remarks, no, I want to thank immensely to Anne Garland Mahler and Christine Hong for their presentation. Thanks, Katz, and of course, thanks to my co-host, Jennifer Chung and Nanki Lee. The next meeting of the next event for the Black Lives Matter will happen in the next quarter on Friday, January 22. Sorry, on Friday, January 22. Yeah, there will be an event called Abolitionists and Emancipatory Futures, Anti-Racist Struggles and Climate Justice. No? So we will move to environmental issues. And on the Friday, January 29th, in the new year, there will be another presentation with the title to be announced, with Didier Fassin among the opponents. So this is the, the Adam, for this series, and again, thank you everybody so much. To the people who are listening, this will be posted, as Jennifer says, at the International Institute website. Thank you so much again, and see you soon at some point.
Thank you all.